Hey everybody, how are you? So I've been saying for a while how strongly affected I was by what happened on January 6th, and because of that, I wanted to focus in on the two things that were most key on that day, that is voting and violence. Now I was originally planning to do this as a single video, but as I've been going along, I realized I was dealing with several hours worth of material. So now I'm going to split it up into about 3 separate videos. For this first one, we're going to talk about voting. We're going to get into voter fraud, voter security, voter suppression, and we're also going to be going into covering some of the demographical and historical context behind all of that. The next video is going to be a similar exploration of how the far right does violence with some historical background there too. And for the third video, we're going to bring in all of those historical trends together along with some other information and see how all of that stuff fits together to make an event like January 6th possible in the United States. Buckle up, people, it's a trip. So starting with voting, I wanted to talk over a few things. I've been thinking about how best to cover all of my bases here in a way that makes sense, so I wanted to kind of lay a foundation for why what happened on January 6th happened. The fact is that there was absolutely no evidence of voter fraud of any kind, certainly not determinative voter fraud in the 2020 election, or in any major US election in like a century. Before anyone's heads explodes, yes, I will circle around back to explore the evidence that Trump's people presented and why it's all BS. That's going to be in the third video about January 6th. But for now, just bear with me through this assumption that there is no evidence of any voter fraud recently. So when Trump came out in the 2020 election and said it was stolen from him by voter fraud, that actually wasn't a new thing. Before he won in 2016, Trump was saying that it was going to be rigged against him, though he changed the tune when he won. Hell, he even said the first 2016 primary was rigged when he lost the Iowa contest to Ted Cruz. And now let's be clear, there is again zero evidence that any of these elections were marred by fraud. We're going to get into the evidence around all of that later on, but for now, I'm just asking you to take it on faith. So why was it that Trump was able to get away with this? How was he able to convince so many of his fellow Republicans that the system was rigged? Well, it's because he wasn't telling them anything that they didn't already believe. Republicans had been pushing lies about voter fraud for almost half a century, and it's time that you all learned about that history. Now, before we get into the how of politicians, especially on the right, attacking our voting system, first we have to look at why. Why is it that, since at least the 1980s, scaring people about voter fraud and election integrity has become a key part of their strategy? Let's look into it. So, the main important aspect that you got to know about here are demographic dead ends. I'm going to tell you a secret that every major Republican political operator knows full well and is desperate to keep hidden. Republicans simply cannot win national elections democratically. They just can't. And I'm going to pull up some data for you looking over the last several decades worth of elections to prove that point. Now, I know we all learned this in high school, but just in case, I'm going to give a little reminder of how our presidents are elected. You see, we don't actually vote for the president, not directly. We vote for the guys who then vote for the guys, or eventually gals, who become president. When someone wins in a particular state, that state will send out a slate of electors who then go on to vote for their respective state winners. It's those electoral college votes that you actually need to become president, 270 of them to be exact. Now, electoral college representation is handed out the same way as legislative representation. A state gets one electoral vote for each House and Senate member they have in their delegation. House members are divided up by population, but senators are 2 per state regardless of the population. Because those 2 senators are the same, regardless of the size of the state, smaller population rural states have a slight but important advantage in both the legislature and the electoral college that picks the president. Keep that in mind for later. So, let's take a look at some elections. Starting with 1988, we got original vintage George Bush as president with a pretty comfortable win. It was 426 to 111 in the electoral college, and in terms of vote totals, that was 48.9 million votes compared to 41.8 for Democrat Dukakis. That's 53.4% to 45.7% on the popular vote. It's a solid win. However, the next election brings some changes. So the Republican Party at that point has held the presidency for 12 years. They've got 8 for Reagan, another 4 for Bush, but now they've lost the chair to Bill Clinton, who won in a very solid win, 370 to 168 in the Electoral College, 44.9 million to 39.1 million votes, coming in at 43% versus 37.4%. The next term, Clinton won by even bigger margins in both the electoral and popular vote, so the Democrats are on a roll. Then came the 2000 election. We got a new Bush from the Republicans, and from the Democrats we got Al Gore, who'd been the VP for Clinton. This election was, unlike what had been going on for the past couple of decades, unbelievably close. By popular vote, Gore had a small but significant advantage. He was literally 103 votes shy of 51 million, while Bush was a little bit below 50.5. However, Bush won in the Electoral College by a very slim margin, 271 to 266. And that margin was given to him by Florida, which he won in an incredibly close race. In fact, the votes were so close that Florida was doing a recount, with Gore actually slowly catching up to Bush, but the recount was stopped by a Republican-controlled Supreme Court, earning Chief Justice John Roberts eternal contempt from certain people, including myself, but that's a story for another time. Anyway, Bush is elected president, but Gore wins the popular vote. As an incumbent running again in 2004, Bush did win both in the electoral and popular votes, but it was close, being only 25 electoral votes and 2.5 points above John Kerry from the Democrats. Now in 2008, the tide turns again and Barack Obama becomes president. A lot of people in this country were very happy about that. Some people weren't. One of those particular people decided to start a bunch of conspiracy theories that Obama wasn't born in America, and birtherism was one of the many lies told by this particular person, who we will unfortunately have to hear more about later. I'm attaching a link to Obama's original birth certificate in case anybody still needs the proof. Anywho, Obama wins comfortably in 2008 and again in 2012 against McCain and Romney respectively. Republicans realized that something needed to change. They needed to start broadening their appeal to minorities. One particular senator who's still in office, Lindsey Graham, had this to say: "The demographics race, we're losing badly. We're not generating enough angry white guys to stay in business for the long term." Ah, Lindsey, you are a never-ending source of quotes, showing just how horribly the Republican Party has degenerated in the last few years. Graham honestly confuses me sometimes. Every once in a while he says something true and decent, and then he goes on Fox News and he just lies to people. So now we get to 2016. At this point, the Republican Party realizes that it has to appeal to a more diverse crowd, something more colorful. Unfortunately, the color they decided to go with was orange, so Donald Trump became the Republican candidate. They went with a guy who was charged by the government for not renting apartments to black people, who said that not all Mexicans are rapists and tried to ban Muslims from the country, and made the extermination of trans people an acceptable talking point in conservative circles. Graham was both wrong and partially right. Turns out it was kind of possible for the Republicans to win with just angry white guys if you made them really storm the Capitol angry. Trump won in the Electoral College 304 to 227 against Hillary Clinton, and unfortunately that's where it counts. However, he lost the popular vote by over 2 points and 3 million people. For the second time in this relatively new century, a president had been elected to office without actually being the choice of a majority of the American people due to the systemic advantage Republicans have with their smaller, more sparsely populated states. That advantage in the Electoral College is important, but not so important as to hold back the tide of demographics. The advantage in the Electoral College that's been keeping Republicans in the presidency is bumping up against the fact that Republicans are appealing to an ever-shrinking portion of the population. Republicans massively underperform in any group that isn't white, straight, older Christian men, and that group is shrinking as a percentage of the population. I'm going to lay that pattern out for you with some pretty specific data. The Roper Center at Cornell University has an extremely convenient page, literally called How Groups Voted, that lays out all of this very clearly. In 2016, Trump won the white vote with 57%, Hillary got the black vote with 89%, the Hispanic vote with 66%, and the Asian vote with 65%. In 2020, Biden got 87% of the black vote, 65% of the Hispanic vote, and 61% of the Asian vote. Trump got 58% of the white people. The picture here is very clear. Trump has a commanding lead with white voters. Biden takes an even larger percentage of everyone else. Now, you might have heard, mainly from Trump's campaign, that Trump is somehow going to get the votes of people of color back onto his side. Admittedly, the Trump campaign is using a very novel approach, in fact, unprecedented approach, to try to appeal to black voters. Oh yeah, Trump's a real maverick. He's eschewing the typical Washington insider approach of actually addressing issues that affect black people, like police reform or educational opportunity. No, Trump's idea is that since he's now a very publicly indicted and recently convicted criminal defendant, and of course all black people have a criminal record and they will vote for him in sympathy. Okay. Now, I'm sure that the sight of a rich old white man remaining free after doing a coup and stealing classified documents and threatening the families of judges while black men are regularly getting shot for jaywalking will send black voters to the poll in droves, I really don't think they'll be voting for Trump. And the fact is that there's nothing in the data to show a significant realignment among minority voters. There's been some polling showing that on the peripheries in certain areas, there's movement of a handful of percentage points in Trump's favor. But the fact is that Democrats have a 30-plus point lead with some of these groups, and that's not going away. Of course, this applies not just to Trump, but to any Republican candidate on a national level. At the same time, the Democrats have this commanding lead among minorities. Minorities are starting to become not so much minorities, if you get what I mean. I've got a source listed in the description coming from the Brookings Institution that predicts America to have a minority white population by 2045. That article was from 2018, and then I've got another from 2020 saying that America was diversifying even faster than predicted. Back in 1980, America was 80% white. By 2000, it was just under 70%. In 2020, around 60%. That's about 10% every 20 years. So 2045 or earlier seems like a damn good estimate for when whites become less than half of the population of the country at large. The math here is not difficult, and for Republicans, it's pretty damning. Unless there's some sort of massive reversal, Republicans just won't be able to win on the national level. The presidency will be out of their reach, and somehow I just can't see the party that wants to ban DEI or teaching African American history or just any acknowledgement of the concept of diversity is suddenly going to start appealing to people of all colors. And that leaves Republicans with a problem. To achieve power in a democratic system, you have to convince a majority of the population that your ideas are right. If you're losing and your ideas just aren't accepted by a majority of the population, typically what you're supposed to do is change your ideas. Now, if you don't want to change your ideas, that's fine. What you're supposed to do in that case is lose. Lose with dignity, accept the democratic process, and move on. Since Republicans can't, 1, convince non-white people to support them, and 2, won't change their policy standpoints to be more accommodating to non-white people, they've been resorting to other options. Option 3 is screwing with the democratic process. Option 4 is physical violence. The Republicans have been comfortable with the former for decades now, but more recently, even violence is becoming acceptable for them as a method of achieving power. January 6th was both of these things coming together. But today, we're going to stick to voting. Now, I'm going to say some things that are going to sound a bit contradictory, but actually aren't. 1, screwing around with our electoral system / voting is absolutely integral to the Republican Party's national strategy. 2, at the same time, voter fraud in America is almost non-existent. How can this be? How can it be that Republicans are constantly screwing with voting if voter fraud is non-existent? It's because in America, our complicated as hell system can be messed with in a million ways without so much as a single undead, transsexual, Mexican, terrorist, illegal immigrant vote needing to be cast, or whatever else they're inventing on Fox News these days. People who are not living legal citizens of the United States cannot legally vote in the United States election. Moreover, only people who have registered to vote can do so. When someone registers, they have to provide some form of documentary proof of who they are, and that they are eligible with some variances per state. And this is actually a really important point. Only people who are registered can vote. That means that every single ballot has to be linked to someone on that list. Now, there are multiple ways to make sure that the person who filled out that ballot is who they claim to be, including signature matching, address matching, voter habit pattern matching. There are even algorithms that detect if a particular district has a different voting pattern than expected, etc. However, you can actually leave all of that to the side. Even without all of those serious security features, any form of fake vote casting runs into a very serious problem. So, you can't just make up random extra ballots unassigned to anyone. If you have 1,000 ballots for candidate X, every ballot has to be linked to a registered voter. What happens when that voter turns in their own ballot? You're going to wind up with two for the same person, which is going to trigger an investigation, and someone's going to go to jail for a felony. Now, maybe you get lucky. Maybe you got someone who died or who left the country or for some other reason decided they don't want to vote, and you managed to dodge all the various security features. What have you got then? One vote. You think you can pull that off 5 million more times in multiple states? And even one, by the way, is 5 years in jail. So I've put some links in the description, but I've also read plenty of studies that show that actual voter fraud is just incredibly rare, literally 1 in a million. When there's any suspicion of voter fraud happening, there are plenty of really robust measures to investigate and verify, including hand recounts of every single ballot. Moreover, in the very, very few instances where an investigation turns something up, it's often something very innocuous, like someone who mailed in their illegal ballot before Election Day, but then had an unfortunate unplanned meeting with the Grim Reaper before the votes were counted. Large-scale voter fraud on the level that moves elections, it just doesn't happen. The main reason for this is the simple fact that you can affect hundreds of thousands of votes in every state without needing to fake a single ballot by bending the law rather than outright breaking it. Now, before I continue, I want to address something. I briefly want to talk about personal stories, because every single conservative I know, almost without exception, has some sort of personal anecdote about voter fraud. You know, my cousin told me when he went to vote last time that he saw so-and-so moving ballots from one box to the other, or a lady I worked with told me that she used to go to old people's homes and collect all the unfilled ballots of dementia patients and fill them out for Democrats, or some variation of one of these stories. The thing about all these stories, though, is that they just aren't true. However, I want to be clear, that doesn't mean that your conservative friend or relative is knowingly lying to you when they tell you these stories. Very often, they're just repeating things that they heard from other sources or from someone else. I don't want to get a tangent on the psychology of memories, but let's just say I have personally encountered multiple instances when someone remembered something as if it had happened to them, when in reality they just heard it again and again and again and again on Fox News. The human mind is an interesting place. Anyway, if you really want to pop the bubble on all these personal anecdotes of fraud, just ask, if they were so chatty with you, why didn't your cousin, friend, neighbor's masseuse, whatever, who saw this fraud, go to the police? Why didn't you go to the police? The thing is, at the end of the day, all of that voter fraud stuff is just straight up illegal in every state. If voter fraud is so rampant, why isn't anyone prosecuting it? Why have all these Republicans, who apparently know for a fact that voter fraud is everywhere, they're supposedly sitting on troves and troves of evidence, why aren't they doing anything? There are arms of government that prosecute voter fraud. They do it on a regular basis when it does occur. If MTG knows where all the fraud is going down, why isn't she telling law enforcement about it? Why aren't red state governors bringing massive prosecutions against these people who are supposedly stealing millions and millions of votes? Republicans do so much to prevent rampant voter fraud without actually identifying any instances of fraud. It reminds me a lot of the number of anti-trans bills that are passed to prevent supposed grooming of children and pedophilia. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, the whole MAGA crew love to get on Fox News and talk about how the schools in their neighborhoods are encouraging pedophilia. But they never bother to mention this to, I don't know, the police or child protective services. It's a pattern. You create an imaginary problem to justify measures taken to combat it and tailor those measures in such a way that it achieves the Republicans' real goals. Scaring people about pedophilia enables them to create laws that exclude trans people from public life. Scaring people about voter fraud enables them to create laws to keep the wrong kind of people from voting. And that's actually the main problem we have in our electoral system. It's not voter fraud per se, but rather politicians trying to pick who it is that gets to vote for them. And there's a variety of ways that politicians try to do this, and we're going to get into that in just a little bit. However, I know that there are going to be people who watch this video who are going to have a really hard time putting aside the belief that our elections are riddled with fraud. If you've been hearing for years and years on Fox News and from Republican elected officials that voter fraud is rampant, and all of your Republican friends believe it is, it's hard to put that aside. But for those of you who are like that, take a look at some of the sources in the description and then do your own research. Try to find one specific incidence of major voter fraud in a recent election. Now, you're going to find plenty of claims and stories about suitcases full of ballots or trucks full of ballots or voting machines and whatnot. Pick any of them. Dig a little deeper. See if you can find the original source. See if there are any official documents or affidavits. Did someone offer sworn testimony? Hell, half the time you won't even be able to find one single concrete verifiable detail, like Who was carrying this suitcase of ballots? Where was this truck going? Any of that stuff. It's nowhere to be found. Really, I'm telling you, try to find the evidence. I'd love to see it. But the fact is, you don't have to cast a single fraudulent vote in order to steal an election. There are plenty of much more effective, much more dangerous ways to move the results that are actually going on right now, every goddamn day in America, and that's what we're going to look into next. First, I want to talk to you guys about something you may have heard of before, gerrymandering. Elbridge Gerry had signed the Declaration of Independence before becoming governor of Massachusetts, so this particular brand of political sleaze can be traced right back almost to the founding of the Republic. Remember that according to the Constitution, each state is largely responsible for setting up its own elections, even for federal offices. Now, as the centuries have passed, there have been some restrictions on that, but it still mostly holds true. And one of the particular areas over which the states have control is the drawing of legislative districts in the state. They don't get to pick the number of representatives, as that's done by population, but they do get to pick which chunk of the state fills which particular seat. Now, ideally, this should not be a big deal. It's not that hard to split up the state's population into particular sized chunks on a map. But then came something that we all love in this country, political parties. As it happened, our founding fathers happened to hate the idea of political parties as well, but they happened anyway, and when political parties get involved, things get messy. Back in 1812, Gerry's party, which was called the Democratic Republicans, go figure, was looking to pick up some seats in Massachusetts, and they made an important observation. While voters are spread out all over the place, party partisans tend to be clustered. It's often the case that certain neighborhoods, towns, counties, etc. can be dominated by one party in a way that really doesn't reflect the state at large. Just like today, in other places in this country, you can go certain neighborhoods where you can comfortably predict how every single person voted without meeting a single one of them. So if you know a certain way which area is going to vote, and you're the one creating the maps that set up who's voting for which representative, you can give your side a massive electoral advantage. Gerry's party gained 3 seats in that election cycle. However, when you're drawing maps in order to scoop up partisan areas rather than for any sort of geographical sense, you're going to wind up with some crazy looking maps. And there was one particular district that looked so much like a slithering salamander that people ended up calling it Gerry Salamander or gerrymander. Voila. So those are the 2 main techniques for gerrymandering. You've got one called packing, where you try to shove as many of your opponents in the same district as possible to clear your way in other districts, and cracking, where you then split up and dilute your opponents into smaller groups, so it's harder for them to get a majority in any particular district. This works both at the state and federal level, be it for the state legislatures or for the National Congress. And when it comes to gerrymandering, Republicans objectively do more of it. On the federal level, for about 10 years between 2010 and 2020, they had a pretty crushing advantage. The Democrats just weren't ready in 2010 for the massive attack of redistricting the Republicans had planned, but by the next census, which appropriated the districts, they had managed to more or less even the field. A lot of that was blocking or reversing Republican gerrymanders, though some of it was by increasing their own. I don't particularly like the idea of fighting fire with fire in this case. I think nonpartisan independent redistricting, as is the case in several states, should be the rule everywhere. But until it is, Democrats are likely going to continue to try to address this disadvantage, and on the federal level, they largely have. The last midterms gave us a House split that was within a point of the popular vote, so that's progress. On a state level, however, it's a much uglier picture. The average Democratic state house is gerrymandered 8 points in their favor. For Republicans, it's 13.5. Again, Republicans have managed to stack things in their favor. Moreover, I just want to point out that none of this is subjective. This isn't my opinion. This is mathematically provable. You can go yourself, look up the election results in each of these states, compare it to the makeups of their legislature, plug it into a calculator, and get the results. It's that simple. The reason I bring this up is because I was having a conversation with a MAGA supporter who told me, with absolute confidence, the Democratic fraudulent votes can influence an election by between 5 or 7% or something like this. They'd heard it from some guy on a YouTube channel. And where the hell did that guy pull such a number from? What data was this based on? How was it derived? And I'll often hear an answer like, oh, it's just common sense. Everybody knows, yada, yada, yada. No, guys. Not everybody knows. These people on Fox News are just pulling stuff out of their asses. There is literally nothing there. There was a clip on Fox News that I'll attach in the description. It's Greg Gutfeld on the 5. And I'm going to read out to you what he said word for word. Though, before I do, I just quickly want to apologize. I'm usually not half bad at imitating accents, but I haven't quite managed to master that tone of pretentious asshole that Gutfield has down pat, so I'll just read it straight. Anyway, in Gutfield's words, I'm worried about what we don't see. What are the Democrats cooking up with the votes, legal or illegal? Judging by your ears or your eyes, this election should not even be close. So the Dems have two options. One, accept the outcome, be comforted by the fact that you got one Biden term, a deal with a dementia-ridden devil, or resort to electoral dirty tricks. And that's why we need the utmost transparency, because I fear the Dems will go the second route, although I have very little evidence on that, but that hasn't stopped me before. Literally everything in that paragraph is wrong and infuriating, and trust me, it's even worse hearing it directly from that smarmy little turd. Let's unpack this a little, shall we? First line, I'm worried about what we don't see. Of course! Only a rabid lefty lunatic would pay attention to problems that you could actually look at and show to others, right? Gutfield knows that all this cooking up votes is something he and his MAGA cronies cooked up themselves. So of course you're not going to see anything. He's creating the permission structure for people to believe in something in the absence of any actual proof. Moving on. Judging by your ears or your eyes, this election should not even be close. This one drives me absolutely crazy. It's right up there with everybody knows or perfectly obvious and common sense. It regularly amazes me watching Fox News the sheer amount of things that Sean Hannity or Greg Gutfield or Jeanine Pirro think are perfectly obvious to everybody. Literally anything they want to believe, be it that the 2020 election was stolen or that global warming is a hoax or that gay people can't raise children, is always perfectly obvious. That's why you don't need any actual proof or evidence, because everybody knows. What they're doing is basically mental masturbation. It's a bunch of people who all believe the same thing, sitting in a circle, agreeing with each other about how right they all are, stroking their egos smooth. To me, the idea that anyone would vote for this traitorous, criminal, lunatic rapist is anything but obvious. However, I, unlike Gutfield, have accepted the fact that people do vote for the other side, regardless of how insane that seems to me. I've literally spent the last 3 years trying to figure it out. But Gutfield and the other MAGA people, they have a much better way of doing things. Any facts they don't like, they just ignore. Oy vey, moving on. Again is Gutfield. So the Dems have two options. One, accept the outcome, be comforted by the fact that you got one Biden term, a deal with the dementia-ridden devil, or resort to electoral dirty tricks. Look, I'm going to leave the dementia thing alone for now, other than to say that Joe Biden does not have dementia, and that can be proven objectively in another video. I want to focus on the rest of it. What Gutfield says the Dems have two options is creating a false dichotomy. He's saying it's either this or that, when in reality, those are not the only two options. Gutfield just assumes flat out what he's trying to prove, that there's no way for Biden to win this election and as such he will resort to cheating. And I gotta say again, I'm occasionally envious of some of these MAGA nutjobs, because they can just make shit up. Here I am spending a good chunk of this video making the claim that it's very unlikely, based on recent trends, for a Republican to win the popular vote, and I'm busting my ass digging through data and statistics and providing evidence and charts and whatnot. But our boy Greg can just declare that the Democrat cannot win under any circumstances just by keeping his ear open. It almost sounds like a goddamn superpower, doesn't it? Or maybe, just maybe, Greg and all of his friends in Fox News are utterly full of shit and make this all up as they go along. Which brings us to the final line of Greg's quote. I have very little evidence on that, but that hasn't stopped me before. Well, no shit, Greg. Maybe it should have stopped you. Maybe if you put half the effort into growing a conscience that you put in your fucking hairdo, we wouldn't be in this situation. In a world where we have real problems, they are just making shit up. And as Greg said, without any goddamn evidence. Now, I wish I could say that this was random. I wish I could say that the MAGA crowd was making up all these stories of voter fraud for no particular reason other than causing chaos. Unfortunately, it's part of a broader strategy. These claims of voter fraud are used to pass legislation that keeps people from voting. Let's get into some of that data. One of the most common avenues of attack for Republican voter suppression is voter ID laws. We've all heard of this, and every time I talk with a conservative about this, I get the same response: who doesn't have an ID? And I'm going to be honest, when I was younger and more conservative, like my relatives, I thought exactly the same thing, but then I grew up and decided to actually look it up. And it turns out there's a ton of people who don't have ID. In 2023, a study from the University of Maryland found 29 million voting-age citizens without a driver's license and 7 million with no current government ID at all. In 2020, it would have only taken a few tens of thousands of votes and a handful of key swing states for that election to go the other way, despite Biden's 7 million person popular vote margin. So this is a big goddamn deal, especially when you consider that just since the 2020 election, 16 states have passed more restrictive voter ID laws. We are disenfranchising a chunk of the population big enough to sway literally any election without any evidence that there's actually a problem to solve. Actually asking questions like this and following them to the end is how I ended up becoming much more liberal. It became a pattern that things that I had assumed to be true just weren't. Unfortunately, there was another pattern I noticed which also carries through here. The more you look into it, the more you literally realize that literally everything bad falls disproportionately on the poor and people of color. This is no different. Those groups are exactly the ones less likely to have voter ID and thus more likely to be disenfranchised by these laws, and Republicans know this. Once might be a coincidence, but this is far more than once. Let me give you a few examples. We were talking earlier about gerrymandering. Gerrymandering, like every other goddamn thing, is also often specifically targeted at black people. Just recently, we had cases in Louisiana and Alabama that were dealing with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You see, in America, black people technically got the right to vote after the Civil War, but they couldn't really use that right until the 1960s when the Voting Rights Act was passed, as the act shut down a whole lot of shenanigans that had been specifically targeted at black people. Among those shenanigans involved the packing and cracking. As you recall, gerrymandering works by either cracking groups of people apart, so there aren't enough of them to affect the outcome, or else packing them all together in the same district so that they can't have an effect anywhere else. For a century, this was targeted specifically at black people so that their candidates would never get into office. Thanks to the VRA, black people are supposed to have the chance to elect a number of representatives equal to their population in the state. Example, a state that's 25% black and has 8 districts should have 2 districts with a majority black population so that they can at least have a chance to pick their candidate 25% of the time. After the 2020 census, both Louisiana and Alabama were supposed to have 2 black districts, but both states simply refused. They were taken to court, and in these cases, the violations were so clear that even some of the conservatives on the Supreme Court admitted that it was an illegal attempt to take away the votes of black people. However, it was damn close. Due to various delay tactics, the Republicans have actually been able to use some of these illegal maps for at least the previous election cycle. Those Republican states will continue to try this, and our current SCOTUS under John Roberts is helping them. Even though Roberts upheld the VRA this time, the dissents written by Thomas and Alito make it clear that they are gunning to take the VRA down entirely. And during his tenure, Roberts has already weakened the VRA significantly. In order for you to understand just how serious a threat taking down the VRA is, you've got to understand just how powerful it was when first enacted. The VRA was passed in 1965. In 1962, there were less than 1,500 black elected officials in local government in the South. By 1980, it was 6,500. From 1,500 to 6,500, that's more than a 400% increase. In 1962, Southern black communities received about 1,000 per person for infrastructure. By 1980, it was 2,000. Still less than white people on both fronts, but these are massive differences. The VRA was the difference between black people basically having no vote at all in the South to giving them a decent shot to succeed. One of the most important and effective measures in the VRA was something called preclearance, which required jurisdictions with a history of discriminatory voting practices to run any major changes to their voting laws by the federal government first to make sure that they wouldn't have a negative impact on minority voters. Then came a case called Shelby v. Holder. In Shelby v. Holder, SCOTUS essentially killed the preclearance provision. Specifically, they argued that the formula used to determine which states needed to apply for preclearance due to past discrimination was out of date. It had last been updated in '75 and as such had to be gotten rid of. What's most stunning about this is the sheer hypocrisy. Remember, these Republican SCOTUS judges are all originalists. That means they believe the law is written forever. The only thing that matters is the original language and intent of the lawmakers. These are the same guys who say you can't ban any weapon that wasn't around in 1789 and that women today are only entitled to the standard of medical care in 1350. However, it seems that when it comes to laws that protect the rights of black people, they can't even make it to a midlife crisis before getting killed off. They literally just made up this random expiration date. In 2018, another case called Brnovich v. DNC came along, and Alito and Thomas and their whole crew had another chance to weaken the VRA, making it harder to prove cases of racial discrimination in voting laws. Now, Republicans have used the decades since Shelby to ram through hundreds of laws restricting voting and purging people from voting rolls. Their excuse in almost all of these cases is to prevent supposed voter fraud. In all that time, however, as we already know, they haven't been able to show any evidence that there was any voting fraud, nor that these laws have had any effect in preventing it. Kind of hard to get rid of something that doesn't exist, ain't it? What we do have evidence of, however, is just how badly all of these laws have screwed people of color. In 2012, the last presidential election before Shelby, with the VRA at full strength, the difference in turnout between black and white people was around 1%, almost even. By 2020, it was 11%, and that's just the black people. By the time we add in the Latinos and the Asians and the Native Americans, we're talking about a chunk of the population big enough to have flipped any of our recent presidential elections. Republicans are crafting these laws specifically to exclude people they don't like from voting, and they know it works. There are 1,000,001 ways in which Republicans can and do screw with voters. I mean, they do show some remarkable creativity with their dickishness. Everything from purges of voter rolls to removing polling places to eliminating support and resources for registration to imposing needless burdens on vote collection or mail-in voting. The only two common factors are that they all fall more heavily on non-whites with no money and an underlying sense of just petty cruelty and malice. Here's a few examples. In Georgia, Brian Kemp signed a law that made it illegal to give food or water to people waiting to vote. Why? Because voters in minority neighborhoods always have fewer polling places and longer lines, so lack of water hits them harder, and because these Republicans are just assholes. Here's another one. Texas has been in an absolute roll of closing polling places, increasing the distance people have to travel and how long they have to wait when they get there. Between 2012 and 2018, in places with the least gain in minority population, Texas shuttered only 34 polling places. In parts of the state that had seen the largest increase in black and Latino population, they closed 542 polling places. In Florida, 65% of the population in 2018 voted for a ballot measure that returned the right to vote to people convicted of felonies who'd served their time, so long as they weren't murderers or sexual offenders. In Florida, black people are 5 times more likely to be arrested than whites and twice as likely to be disenfranchised due to a conviction. So the benefits of the mercy shown by the people of Florida would have disproportionately been to their benefit. Unfortunately, the people of Florida elected a guy to their governorship who just hates both mercy and black people. DeSantis passed a law saying that the reenfranchisement will only take effect once the person has paid off all of their fees, court fines, dues, restitutions, whatever. Leave aside how some of these fees leave people in crushing debt even for relatively minor crimes, Florida didn't set up any sort of database or contact system or literally anything else, so these people could see if they owed anything or not. Nor did it inform the reenfranchised people of this law. The result, in a single year they arrested 40 people for voter fraud, despite the fact that all of these people have been told that their voting rights have been restored. This has a chilling effect on all the other former offenders who want to have a say in our politics again, but have literally no way to find out if they even can, and if they guess wrong, they go to jail. Leave aside the fact that this is what 65% of Floridians wanted. It's not like MAGA ever cared about the will of the voters. The petty cruelty of this is just nasty. Finally, I want to share with you guys another tactic that Republicans are using to disenfranchise voters. This one I find particularly scary because of how it enlists regular citizens to try to enact the MAGA anti-democratic agenda. Soon we're going to move on from talking about voting to talking about violence, and there especially you're going to start to see the pattern of how far-right politicians outsource their dirty work to the population at large, but that pattern does start here. Keeping voter rolls maintained and current, removing those who've moved or died, is important work. When done by serious trained people who are nonpartisan, it doesn't cause any problems. However, bad actors can really easily turn voter roll maintenance into what's called a voter purge. In Georgia, the law was changed recently that any person could challenge any number of registered voters at any time for any reason. In the past, this was done by professionals, with regular citizens only providing names if it was a person known to them that had passed away, for example. Now in Georgia, however, it's basically a free-for-all. And what ends up happening is a handful of far-right crackpots start combing through the rolls and removing anyone they don't like the sound of, and you can guess what kind of names they'd be looking for. In fact, in Georgia, of 100,000 challenged names, 89,000 were challenged by just 6 people, and most of the rest by another dozen. One particular character by the name of Frank Schneider ended up submitting by himself over 30,000 names. Who is Frank Schneider? He's a former CFO who loves Trump and hates mail-in voting, and he decided that it was his calling to clean up the voter rolls of anybody he didn't like. No surprise that he's also a booster of the QAnon conspiracy theory. I'll do a video on that one of these days, but long story short, Hillary Clinton is apparently an immortal pedo vampire. Yeah, when you get into MAGA, shit gets weird. And what was the result of Schneider's heroic efforts to protect Georgia from the equally real problems of voter fraud and baby blood vampirism? A man dying of cancer had to drive 2 hours to fight the challenge. Moreover, this man was immunosuppressed due to the cancer treatment, which made him extremely vulnerable to infection, and now he has to get in a crowded hearing to defend himself and get his right to vote back. That's insane! Imagine if he hadn't been that damn determined, and all for no other reason other than Schneider didn't like his name or whatever other nonsense excuse he made up. The Georgia election in 2020 was won by some 11,780 votes, as Trump so thankfully reminded us when he called Brad Ravensburger in order to try to steal them. One schmuck, like Schneider, by himself, challenged over 30,000 votes. That's 3 times the electoral margin of victory for one guy. I wanted to point out these numbers to you to emphasize some of my earlier points. Voter fraud isn't necessary to sway the outcome of any election. There are, unfortunately, much easier and completely legal ways to do it. Now let's quickly run over what we've learned. No Republican has won the popular vote in 20 years. Twice in this century, they've been able to get into the office of president only because of certain quirks in the Electoral College. 2. Their advantage will run out soon because Republicans are coming up on a demographic dead end. The type of people they appeal to are becoming a smaller and smaller chunk of the population, and they can't really win national context democratically. 3. There is zero evidence that voter fraud is common in the U.S., or that it has swayed any major elections in our time. Rather, all evidence points to voter fraud being extremely rare, on the order of 1 in a million, and even most of those are accidents. If someone attempts voter fraud, we've got some damn robust measures to catch it and make sure the count is right. Moreover, if someone does get caught committing voter fraud, they can go to jail for a very long time. There are much easier ways to corruptly influence the results of elections, and you don't even have to break the law to do it. In fact, the main reason why Republicans constantly scare people about voter fraud is specifically so they can pass laws that disenfranchise people they don't like. And so far, they've been damn successful. Their efforts at voter suppression have been effective enough to cause voting rates among blacks and whites to go from roughly even as recently as 2012 to an 11-point disparity for black voters less than a decade later. Between voter suppression and gerrymandering, Republicans have managed to create a voter disparity bigger than the margin for any election that we've ever had. This is literally the difference between one side and the other holding the reins of power in government. If we want to get serious about fixing voting in America, there's a lot that we can do. In fact, I think it's a damn good topic for a future video, but for today, I want you to remember this. When you hear a Republican talking about Democrats stealing votes, or dead people voting, or illegals voting, whatever it is, it's bullshit. Instead of checking for zombie voters, you should be keeping a close eye on them because they are trying to steal your vote. The Republicans who are talking about all of this, they are the actual threat. And it's not because of actual fraud, but by closing polling places in your district, or by getting you thrown off the rolls without telling you, or keeping you from voting by mail, or just splitting up your district so you get swallowed up by people of the other party. Basically, if you want your vote to count, vote blue. Thanks for watching that, guys. I really appreciate it. If you liked that video, then please like the video. And also subscribe. That will be really, really helpful. And most of all, please leave a comment if you can, because firstly, it really helps algorithmically, and also I'm pretty new at this, and I could use the feedback. So if you could do that and also share these videos with your relatives and friends, that would be really nice. Till next time, guys. Bye-bye.